I thought I'd read a little bit of the chapter that was one of the real motivations for my writing this, which of course we all know that Mr. Collins married the wrong person, and it was just simply not possible to leave Lady Catherine around to insult Mrs. Darcy for eternity. And so 3 bad things happened to Lady Catherine, and this is the first. I also want to just back up and say, at this time, which is roughly 10 years after Pride and Prejudice, which we know was written twice, 1795 and published in 1813, and next year is its 200th anniversary, 2 things happened. One was that the Napoleonic Wars were finally over, and with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, after 30 years, the British could finally travel abroad. And so you had a very wealthy group of people who had kind of been bugging each other at each other's house, to wit Elizabeth Darcy visiting Pemberley, and now all of a sudden it was raining Englishmen on the continent. And so a large part of this book is actually a grand tour. The Darcys make a grand tour, and I can tell you more about how I did that. But I did spend a long time trying to make it very factually and politically and geographically and historically correct. So we can infer that when we say at long last Colonel Fitzwilliam's regiment was returned from the continent, he was serving the Napoleonic Wars. It had been above 2 years since he had last secured leave, and he spent his few weeks' leisure in Derbyshire. Colonel Fitzwilliam had, therefore, not paid his annual visit to Rosings for several years, as was long his custom. These visits were necessarily not so pleasant as formerly, occurring now as they must without Darcy's companionship. By an implicit mutual understanding, the Colonel's company without Mr. Darcy was not so agreeable to Lady Catherine, so his visits had been correspondingly shortened in duration following the Darcy's marriage. As he had long been in the habit of attending upon his aunt each year, the Colonel's honorable nature would not admit of a complete amendment arising solely from the loss of pleasure to himself. Accordingly, he went to Rosings at an early opportunity with the conviction that a labor sooner undertaken is a labor soon done. A naturally more patient man than his cousin Mr. Darcy, Colonel Fitzwilliam bore Lady Catherine's obtrusiveness and his cousin Anne's obmutescence with better philosophy and hence better grace. Within a few days of his arrival at Rosings, Lady Catherine would abridge her instructions for his welfare to not more than 3 or 4 an hour, and Mr. Bird might proffer a few vapid remarks if Lady Catherine should happen to be momentarily absent. In the first instance, Colonel Fitzwilliam's very existence without such constant instruction was nothing short of wonderful, given his occupation as a military man. And in the second, it required the cunning of Ulysses and the strength of Atlas to produce the shortest of speeches from men, and these transitory rewards were delivered with neither information nor sensibility. The officiousness of his aunt had become too commonplace to be wondered at, but Mr. Berg's unalterable habit of lapsing into a steadfast silence the moment Lady Catherine reappeared, regardless of the state of any preceding conversation, never ceased to surprise the Colonel, who considered such behavior as singular well past the point of incivility. More than once did Colonel Fitzwilliam compare his 2 cousins, concluding that the one lady was silent from her great desire to please, whilst the other from her equally strong desire not to please. One evening soon after his arrival, upon finding himself sitting alone after supper, Lady Catherine addressed him thus: "Well, George, 'tis a dreadful business about Darcy, but as they are married, suppose there is nothing to be done about it now. I have long been resigned to the disgrace attending this deplorable alliance, but as you know, my sympathy is never directed toward my own complaints. However, Anne yet suffers the disappointment attending Darcy's selfish violation of all claims of honor and duty due to his family, an affliction I do not intend to brook any longer. As my first duty is to my daughter, I must no longer suspend decisions to the best alternate course for her happiness. These 5 years are now passed without any change in Anne's inclination to marriage, and it occurs to me as the most sensible, indeed, as the only acceptable alternative, that I should give my consent to your marriage with my daughter. To be sure, you have no fortune, and therefore no prospect of marriage with anyone of her rank and situation in life. Her beauty and person are superior, her accomplishments unsurpassed, and as my daughter, she would be a match far above any you could hope to make without the benefit of an interest which, as a younger son, you are unlikely to receive. Colonel Fitzwilliam was taken entirely by surprise and could only stare with unaffected astonishment as she continued. In considering your own recommendations, I know your disposition to be good and your family excellent. My own observation leads me to conclude that, as Anne cannot be the wife of Mr. Darcy, to become the wife of Colonel Fitzwilliam is not a situation to be regretted or otherwise looked upon as exceptional in any way. To be sure, there's a great disparity in fortune, which, in these times, is nothing very wonderful. Colonel Fitzwilliam had colored deeply during this last volley, making every attempt to keep his composure and recall the courtesy due his aunt, despite her being, in the present situation, little deserving of any such civil consideration. At the earliest pause, he quietly but firmly replied, "Indeed, ma'am, you do me too much honor. As we are both aware, my low prospects as the younger son are not such that Miss de Bourgh's birth or person should merit. Whilst I am not insensible of the compliment of your proposal, I must decline out of deference to my regard for Miss de Bourgh." "Nonsense!" exclaimed Lady de Bourgh. "Whilst Anne is doubtless one of the most favored of her sex, she is approaching an age when it is desirable to have her well married, and I am convinced that she could do much worse," said Lady Catherine in a rare moment of compliment abroad. "In addition to being a close relation, your modesty tells me you are sensible of your good fortune in securing such a wife. Therefore, we may consider the matter as settled." That's it. In my defense for having written a sequel to Jane Austen, I would like to point out I started this in 1984, the year that I was one of the founders of the Stanford Jane Austen Society, and a time when being a member of the Jane Austen Society was still a little suspect, and you were regarded, I think, as a little arcane in your interests. For the next 26 years, I didn't read anything that came out, and the other thing I did was I didn't allow myself to see any of the movies except Clueless. Therefore, when I emerged upon the scene, my book went to the publisher on 11/11/11 last year, and I hope to have it all sold out by 12/12/12. When I started looking on Amazon and other places and saw the pages and pages and pages of books that claimed to have something to do with Jane Austen, it was really quite shocking, and I began to understand the lack of enthusiasm of my family and friends for yet another contribution. However, I hope that my book is different. And the other thing I wanted to explain was the genesis of the Chawton House Library and the Center for the Study of Early English Women's Writing. It turns out that in Jane Austen's lifetime, what's called in literature the long 18th century, there were somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 published women authoresses who wrote between 10 and 15,000 books. Name one. No one ever has. It's a great cocktail party setting. And everybody moves away on the other side. The original 1,500 volumes for that library were actually some of the primary sources I used for this book. I had 37 dictionaries. I transcribed 2 manuscript travel diaries and went through law books, agriculture books. My agriculture books are now at Mount Vernon. Traveling books. I've also done a fairly in-depth bit of research on carriages of Jane Austen. And so, of course, a lot of this book has to do with their carriage trip through Europe. So that's how this one is different. And I will say that with respect to obmutescence, if I didn't know that the word was in Austen, I can tell you, I know if the word's in Austen. If I suspected it wasn't, then we went to up to 36 other dictionaries, which included dictionaries of slang, dictionaries for robbers, thieves, and prostitutes, dictionaries for agriculture, chemical engineering, mining, dictionaries in foreign languages, and all sorts of other things. And so I have not yet found anybody who can tell me that I've had a word out of place, although Deirdre LeFay did find what she calls an error, and for anybody who knows Miss LeFay, the rejoinder to that one is only one. So, questions? Yes.
Did you say that Lady Catherine calls Colonel Fitzwilliam George?
That's his first name.
But in Pride and Prejudice, she calls him Fitzwilliam.
She does in here too. It depends on what she wants. When she's trying to be familiar, she calls him by his Christian name. And Fitzwilliam is his last name.
Yes, I know that. Thank you.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I don't know what people know. So when she gets angry with him, she lapses into the Fitzwilliam. And when she wants something, she calls him George. Yes?
I can appreciate why you didn't want to read those that have to do with vampires and whatnot. But did you read any of the really early ones that came out shortly after the book was published?
Oh, you mean the
Sequels or continuances or whatever?
I had read pretty much everything that had come out prior to and during about 1984. Since I worked in technology, I was very conscious of intellectual property. And once I actually started writing the book, that's when I quit. But absolutely, I've read Emily Eden, adore Emily Eden.
You know, I actually, at Austen, the first time that I came across some of the sequels that people had written, so soon after the books were published, and I began to collect them at that time. Some of them
Elizabeth Jenkins, she's excellent, wonderful, wonderful woman.
Yeah, I just wanted to do what they all are so different from what's being written about.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I think had I known, like many of the things I've done in life, I probably wouldn't have done it. I mean, if I had known it's been very difficult to promote the book because of basically guilt by association. I mean, it's very hard to say this one's different. I mean, I have girlfriends who won't even read it. I don't read sequels. I mean, that's Claire Tomlin goes, she's on our board. She's one of our patrons. She goes, I won't read it. I don't read sequels. It's different. No, it's not.
It is.
I just have a question about this exchange. When you were asked about whether or not you'd read the ones immediately following, do you mean immediately following Jane Austen's own book
Yes.
in the 1800s? So Emily Eden and Elizabeth Jenkins are both 19th century writers?
I don't know. You'll have to ask.
Emily Eden is very much a contemporary of Jane Austen's. Elizabeth Jenkins was writing in the 30s, and she was the one, I think, who Jane Austen's family wrote they finished a couple of the novels, but I think the real start of any really serious scholarship and working was Elizabeth Jenkins in the 1930.
Oh, 1930.
And there were some other really good ones in the 50s.
But the ones that I'm talking about, you know, I have about 75. And the ones that I'm talking about, there were some by a woman called Brown. Most of these people have never heard of, but it was a tremendous desire on the part of people who read the books to what happened next.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people worked hard to try to figure that out. And those are the ones I was asking. If I were trying to write a book about it, I wouldn't read it myself because it's too hard to pick up things inadvertently. But it's great fun to read those other ones. If you're really interested, I'll send you a list. You can give me
I'll give you my email address.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes?
Was this something you entirely created yourself, or were there reading over Austen's letters or things like that? How did you come up with what you put into the sequel?
That was really early on. I decided what needed to happen. I needed to marry Mr. Connolly to the right person, and I needed to put an end to Lady Catherine's malicious intent. But other things happened kind of along the way as they needed to happen. But there really wasn't anything in Austen's letters. What I really tried to do was pick up 10 years later, and of course this is a time of enormous technical and social change. I mean, Jane Austen's born in 1775, which is the date of Iron Bridge Gorge, and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And 41 years later, Britain was the most developed capitalist economy on the face of the earth, and by far the wealthiest. And in that transition, the social upheaval going from I'm giving you guys a little taste of my speech here in New York next month on Jane Austen and Money. going from a very land-based rural barter economy to the world's most advanced capitalist cash economy where 75% of the population is now urban is a huge change. And I wanted to really explore how people like the Darcys, who have education and liberality and money, and I impute social consciousness, how they would have adjusted and viewed that kind of extremely rapid fundamental change. And that's where the book ended up going. I mean, I had a few things all along that I wanted to have happen, but whether you call it channeling or whatever, these people took me to these places. I mean, I didn't so much guide them as I ended up there with them. Yes?
How many years did you take the sequel? From 10 years after to...
My book covers about 2 years. So it picks up 10 years after, and we go through probably about 18, 20 months in the book. Yes, ma'am?
I really appreciate your point about that big transition, and I think it's very pertinent to write a book about that kind of a transition, because I feel like we're going through a similar one now with the advent of digital technology in everything, certainly publishing and just how we get our information and everything. And I think it's also very interesting that even just this summer we saw that specific transition illustrated in the Olympic opening ceremonies, very literally taking away that agrarian culture and ushering in the industry.
I think that there's some other really interesting parallels that I hadn't really thought of until I started working on this paper for Jasmine. And we know that this was a time of just hellish gambling. People would lose estates overnight, and my book deals with that. And you see these huge banks, even Jane Austen's brother, going out of business, and you go, well, how do these people not get this? And yet in this time, just recently, we had extremely sophisticated investors losing hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in derivative stock securities. And you go, why didn't they know better? And so you can just watch all of this stuff in this change. And as they're changing from a barter-based economy to a cash economy, we've been through basically a very, very similar thing, going from a cash economy going to a credit economy. And the same kind of people get blindsided in the same way with that same economic and social upheaval. And it was really interesting to me to have gone through this and then to kind of watch it on the, I don't have a TV. I haven't had a TV since I took the Addams Family off the first time. But I mean, to kind of watch it unfold later on and watch people going through the same things because you couldn't see the money. And as soon as you couldn't see the money, there was a problem. Just like in this book, you couldn't see the goods. I mean, it goes from barter to being these bank things, and people can't really conceptualize it, and they end up losing everything. Yes, sir?
Did you enter into this process with the end goal in mind, this 26-year odyssey of writing this novel, or did you kind of just take it as it went? Did you outline the book from the beginning? Did you know what you wanted, or when you were doing your scholarship on Jane Austen, your learning on Jane Austen, I'm sorry, did you know how you wanted the end result to come out?
Both. I'm not nearly crazy enough to try to do this in 26 years. I thought this was going to be easy, and then the more I knew, the less I knew. It's the old Don Henley line. I had the outline. I knew what I wanted to have in large, and I knew I had two really huge problems. I had a huge problem with an issue of transferring of estates, and I had a huge problem with an issue of inheritance. And I solved them. I've read Blackstone. Susan Staves and I became very good friends over this. But there were a lot of different things that came up that had to be solved that were problematic. And then I did a few things in between. And I really didn't pick up the book. I mean, all the time I was studying. I've always been reading these books. I've always been reading all of the history and the agrarian books and the political books and the legal books and the chemical books, and I mean, you name it about this period, I've read it. And 26 years worth, and then it all sort of became the Chawton House Library, which is a great thing, so now somebody can do it next time. But somewhere along the line, what does it say? Life is what happens while you're making other plans. In 2009, I had a huge cataclysm in my life, and I decided I could either get all mopey and be a real pain and annoying, or I could finish my book. And so that's what I did. And then I had a big problem because as I'd been studying, but I hadn't been writing, I had a hiatus of about 7 or 8 years where I hadn't even picked it up. I've been learning, and I've been writing, and I've been researching, I've been collecting information. I have binders and binders and binders of things that I found that went into this, but I wasn't writing, and I had to give myself permission to hate it. If when I came back and I reread it, and I thought it was just rubbish, I gave myself permission to just say, well, it was an interesting trip, and put it back down. But I didn't. I liked it. And my kitty and I were in my motorhome, and I spent 3 weeks getting back in the saddle, and it was a whole lot of fun and a very interesting journey. I can open up places in this book, and I don't remember writing it.
Can you tell us more about Chawton House, how you discovered it, and...
This is Carol Jenkins, my promoter. Like fighters have promoters, and Carol's my promoter. I'm really lucky. I could tell you stories about cabs in New York with Carol Jenkins. She gets dropped off, and I get kicked out. She would never wear my makeup. My best friends never wore my makeup. Got back at you though.
Yeah, I see.
I think this was something from CBS. Chawton House Library is in Chawton, which is the village that Jane Austen lived the last 9 years of her life, and the village from which all 6 novels were sent to publication. It was originally a cottage on her brother Edward's estate, who had been adopted by a wealthy aunt and uncle, because the law of primogeniture, if you don't have an heir, all of your property reverts to the crown, which most people don't think is like a great outcome. And so there's a lot of adopting going on. And he was adopted because the Austens had very many children and not very much money. And he became later on Edward Austen Knight and had 2 huge estates, one in Hampshire in Chawton, and the other Godmersham in a beautiful part of Kent. And I purchased Chawton House with the intention of making the Center for the Study of Early English Women's Writing. And it is today, and we have a MA and a PhD in the long 18th century studies, the Chawton House MA and the Chawton House PhD, and it's great to see these kids coming and going and reading this stuff. We published the Female Spectator, which if you have any interest in the long 18th century and the women whose works were neglected by both the Bodleian and the British Library, both who were legally bound, both of which were legally bound to take the books, and they did not. And so it's Sarah Fielding was more famous in her lifetime than her brother Henry. Fanny Burney was very famous in her lifetime. There were a number of women. Aphra Behn had 17 plays on the London stage in 1 year. Nobody else in history has done that. So it was a wonderful time to be a woman. There were 2 women founding members of the British Royal Academy. There weren't any for another 100 years, including Beatrix Potter, who was turned down. There were women silversmiths, women doing almost every occupation imaginable. And we've discovered women scientists, women mathematicians, women botanists, women biologists, women chemists. I'm finally starting to catch up, I think, with Judy Chicago. And I just found another one, 17th century woman, writing in Science Today. I was reading a book catalog on the way up here on the train. So it's wonderful to find out that Jane Austen was not alone. She was amidst and very well read in a very large group of very intelligent women who had a lot to say, not the least of which, of course, is Mary Wollstonecraft. So it's a good place if you want to read these ladies. I do believe that, although I don't know, because most of these have not been cataloged, many of them that remain to be found. Isabel Grundy, who wrote The Feminist Companion to English Literature, estimates that we will probably find maybe a quarter of these books. The rest of them have gone to Book Hell, which was a traveling library in the 18th century. in the early 19th century, which went around the English rutted roads in the rain in a wagon, pulled by horses, and there were only 200, 250 copies done on a press run because the ladies were paying for that, and they were usually sleeping with their publishers to get that many. So many of them are lost, but I think that we have probably the largest collection of early novels by women. We say from 1600 to 1830, but of course we gladly take anything earlier. And we do keep with women who were writing up through the time of Jane Austen, but not people usually starting afterwards, because there's this jolt in society sort of left this kind of Georgian burlesque, satirical, fun-loving kind of thing, and then it went into the Victorian era, where everything got very dramatic and not at all fun, and life changed for just about everybody. So that's what Chawton does, and I want to encourage everybody to come and see. Just call ahead. We are not allowed, because of our planning permission, to be open to the public, but if you just call and let us know you're coming, we won't be open, but you'll be a special guest. Yes, sir.
You referred to the research you did for the Grand Tour. Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. I would say in the end I probably had a couple of hundred books written between, say, 1815 and 1819 of tours of the continent. And there are two places in this book where you can actually tell what year the book is. And one of them is an event that happened on the Grand Tour. But I went and I had travel books. One of the things that I found that was really interesting, and I don't quite know how to make this available, in this 25 years, having acquired some money, I also acquired subscriptions to Sotheby's and Christie's and Bonham's catalog, and a lot of the research actually came from stuff, that would come through there. Traveling clothes, traveling chests, traveling medicine chests, traveling writing desks, items that had come with people from the Grand Tour, sketches. I had probably a half a dozen manuscript sketchbooks from people writing at the time. This is actually a sketch that I own from 1815. Someone writing on a tour. So I tried to read. Oh, thank you. Everybody says, well, did you go on the Grand Tour? I still have the map in my study with the little dots, and I still have my spreadsheet where I know how far you can go with a coach and four in a day, and I know those roads and I know what they're like. And I have that all mapped out, but mostly I tried to use the primary sources of people writing and diaries. I had some diaries, and just things that I had kind of over the 25 years collected, but I will say that there was an awful lot of things that don't fit the academic research paradigm that came basically from the material culture that these people left as a legacy that goes through those sale rooms. I mean, beautiful, jewelry. There's a part in my book where Darcy looks at a Swiss automaton, came right out of the Bonham's catalog. 1820, beautiful automaton, little mouse covered in pearls. So some of those things came from descriptions of that material culture.